some of you might be more intimately involved with this project than others, so just to give you an introduction, we'll go through the overview of the study. The goals and objectives were to identify opportunities to develop renewable energy on UVM campus, including the Bio-Research Center in the Miller Farm and Trinity campus. That was our area. We researched incentives. We researched feasibility for those technologies, and we did a little bit of work on some of the next steps you guys could take in your overall push to be more sustainable. The goals and objectives were to identify locations and applications for each technology. So we looked at buildings, grounds, we looked at the utility infrastructure around campus. Oh, thanks. And we looked at historical significance, state and local regulatory requirements for each technology to really bring together an overall picture of whether or not they're feasible and where they're feasible on campus. Of course, we followed the master plan. Obviously, we didn't propose to do any installations where there's going to be a new building or where there's not going to be a building in the future. And then for each site we identified, we did an economic analysis to identify, if there was a payback condition, what the costs were, and to try to give you a better picture when you're comparing technologies. There was student participation in this project. We had 3 interns, and I'll describe what they worked on in a little bit. And they were tremendously helpful. And we also have developed a GIS map that shows where all technologies are on campus. And we've hyperlinked that to pictures and reports, so we'll demo that now. So we had 3 students, Ryan, Jack, and Rich, and they worked with me from day one, and I think they really took ownership of the study. They each were in charge of one section. So Ryan was in charge of the wind section, Jack the solar thermal, and Rich geothermal. And along with my support, they helped develop feasibility reports for those technologies. The bulk of their work, though, was the solar PV section, which was the most labor intensive, and they worked on that for probably a solid month. And I think they learned a lot about solar, and in conjunction with some other extracurriculars that we did, including a visit to the solar farm down the road and the factory that makes the solar trackers that you currently have on campus, along with some career path exploration and some tutoring from us on what they could possibly do with their respective engineering degrees. I think that they came away from the study with a lot of relevant real-life experience, and I hope they can apply that in the future. So if I could give you an overview of the applicable incentives for various renewable technologies, there's the standard offer program, which is technically closed now, but for reference, those are the prices that they were offering at the time. And these are for larger renewable energy projects, not interconnected to a building or a specific spot on campus, but fed directly to the grid. Then there's the Clean Energy Development Fund, which is theoretically open to CHP, but we don't see any evidence that it's actually active at this time. The local solar utility tariffs, Burlington Electric Department will be offering very soon, if they're not already, 20 cents per kilowatt hour when connected to a separate service that feeds directly to the grid. And Green Mountain Power, which is south of the athletic facility, offers a net metering bonus of 6 cents a kilowatt hour, which is credited to your bill after you've interconnected your system to that specific building. So for that incentive, you get the offset electricity and 6 cents. With the Burlington system, you just get the 20 cents. Very similar, but 2 different approaches. And then you have Vermont's small-scale renewable energy incentive program. That's the typical incentive program for smaller systems. As you can see, the solar incentive is up to $97,000 or 60 kW. The solar hot water or solar thermal incentive is a maximum of $45,000, and then the wind incentive is actually interesting. It's a hybrid, so they pay 60% based on what you think your wind turbine will produce, and then 40% at year 1 based on what it actually does produce. And the maximum is $455,000 per site. Now those maximums are for nonprofit organizations such as UVM. For residential, commercial, there are different maximums within it. The first technology I'd like to go over is solar PV, solar photovoltaic, solar electric. I'm sure you're familiar with a handful of installations on campus. Our report detailed the technologies and the best practices in the industry, what to look for, what to pay attention to when you're selecting a developer or a project. We reviewed the incentives, I briefly touched on them before. And then we went into the locations. We identified 66 buildings, 29 parking lots, and 3 ground mount sites. And then there you can see the total aggregate of the opportunities we identified. It's pretty significant and amounts to a 12% offset of electrical usage when compared to 2011 campus usage. Now 2012 usage might be different, but we don't have that information yet. For each site we identified, we created a site report, and this is kind of a condensation of one of the site reports that we created for Patrick Gym. And as you can see, we've identified a basis of design equipment, which is equipment we've identified as industry leading or industry standard. And we've identified the type of system. You can see where it would be, and we've identified an estimated install cost and payback with and without incentives. The incentive in that case is the Vermont Small Scale Renewable Energy, and being that this is in Burlington Electric, their 20-cent per kilowatt hour payment. And you can see that it would offset about 10% of the total complex's electrical usage. It's not separately metered, so when we talk about the entire complex, we're talking about the tennis courts and stuff that are attached to this building also. Now, it should be noted that while we calculated payback, that is for owning and operating the system yourself. There are opportunities to do power purchase agreements with developers for anywhere from 5 to 20 years, in which the system could be cash flow positive in year 1, because through PPA you can purchase electricity from the solar developer at less than you currently purchase electricity from, therefore making it cash flow positive. And there's a lot more detail in the report on the specifics of those type of programs. And now I'll pass it on to Jim for cogeneration.
Well, thank you and good morning. So I'm just here to talk about the CHP part of it, or the cogen. This is basically rather substantial power generation and thermal energy production, more than we're talking about with solar and that sort of thing. Cogeneration, or combined heat and power, is defined as the simultaneous production of 2 or more useful forms of energy from a single fuel source, and it's usually electricity and steam or hot water. Steam or hot water either used for a process or for heating a building, such as this building here and the other buildings. And at a higher combined efficiency than each one of these tasks can be done discretely and differently, all by its own. In this study we looked at, we talked to Dave Blatchley and Rick and Sal, I think we talked to you and others, and we identified an obvious cogeneration possibility at the Cage complex. And we talked and took a brief look at the University Heights and see whether CHP made sense at that physical location.
Yeah, just up and down.
So let's look at the Cage complex. And what we took a look at some of the numbers, the preliminary numbers. There was not a lot of finite, absolute detail, but we got some generic numbers from Dave Blatchley. And what we've come up with is basically a 3.5 megawatt. This is substantial power. Basically, it represents about 30% of the campus utilization. 3.5 megawatt gas turbine generator. This is it's similar to a jet engine you see on airplanes, fired by natural gas, with a single pressure heat recovery steam generator. So the gases that come out of a gas turbine are very hot, and you can make a lot of steam from it, basically, and that's called an HRSG. The steam, it would be physically located right beside the Cage complex. Steam and feed water would be connected to the existing cage systems. There's already steam made there, and all those systems that you need to interconnect to are right there. And we'd be like making about 19,000 pounds per hour of steam in the unfired condition. If you take those hot exhaust gases leaving the gas turbine, you add additional fuel to it, raises temperature dramatically. You can dramatically increase the steam production, in this case up to around 50,000 pounds per hour. Curiously enough, that represents, there's rarely times where you're under 50,000 pounds per hour based on your current load profile. This is the net steam production out of the cage complex. So this is a pretty good fit. The thing to note here, we would electrically connect to the 11 large load buildings that are near the cage complex, this being one of them. It requires that we add new high voltage feeders to each one of these buildings. There's something not unique but different about University of Vermont in that every one of your buildings basically virtually is connected to bed individually. It really complicates the addition of cogeneration to this. So we have to make the electricity in one place and then spread it out with individual wires. And then what we have to do is displace beds wires coming into each one of these buildings. It really complicates things. On top of that, and I should mention that some of this feeder upgrade has been underway, Sal, for a couple of years or something like that.
Empty conduits.
Sorry?
Empty conduits.
Yeah, well, that's halfway there. The cables are not in, but the conduits are there, basically. I mean, the right positive steps have been taken at this point in time. It would require a bed upgrade at the cage complex. Bed would have to come in and basically build you a larger line to the cage, because now we're going to displace all these bed feeds to the existing buildings. So now when we're feeding with our gas turbine all these new loads, basically, if that turbine goes down for its scheduled maintenance or any other reason, basically, bed now needs to feed using the system that we put in place. There are issues associated with bed standby charges. There's other legal and commercial negotiations that seems to have occurred about 6-7 years ago, basically. Bed does not want to lose money by having you make electricity. That I would think would apply to anything we're talking about here as far as electricity. There's another curious thing that happens is that because we're only feeding 11 buildings and basically we're not really allowed to export any additional power we're making out to the grid, it will have to be something called a electrical load following system. In other words, we may think we can make 3.5 megawatts, but if the 11 buildings are only needing 3.2 megawatts, then we have to run at 3.2. If you layer on top of that something we found in a 2006 study where basically Burlington Electrical Department said, we always want you to import 300 kilowatts, so that 3.2 becomes 2.9. There are some real barriers to cogeneration at your facility, at your campus, because of issues like this. In this study, it's very complex, it's very legal, you've got to do a lot of negotiating with the right people, you've got to be in the right position to talk about it. It appears to us that these kind of things were started in 2006. I don't know if anybody in the room was involved or anything like that, but if you want to be serious about this project, you have to restart those things. Another twist is Vermont Gas will have to upgrade their gas supply to the cage. Because you need to feed a large gas turbine, heat recovery steam generator, and the existing boilers, basically the volume, the amount of gas that needs to flow to the cage will be more than it does before. That will have to be done for this project to work. We took a look at the estimated cost of this thing. It's in the $18 million region, and we've done a little bit of a twist here in that it is our understanding that UVM is considering a boiler upgrade at the cage complex, or at least they were some time ago. If that project costs in the order of $2.9 to $3 million, you can say, well, I'll avoid that cost by building my $18 million cogen plant. And so the net cost might be $15.7 million, and that's where we started.
That strategy, I believe, is nowhere in my mind, because we upgraded the Gibbon boiler room to take that off the table, additional capacity off the table. Okay, so then in our economics, that 15.7 becomes 18 point something, and all paybacks get longer, basically, if you would. So that dollar value perhaps is without those bed and Vermont gas upgrades included, because depending on how you negotiate those things, they can go in rate base in some jurisdictions. They may not be able to do it here.
One thing of his interest, we're required to look at previous studies, which we did. Dave provided us with a copy of a 2006 cogeneration plant study conducted by WMG Group. As far as we can see, they don't exist anymore. But in any case, they did an extremely comprehensive analysis of cogeneration opportunities at the campus. They came up with the conclusion, 4.5 megawatt gas turbine and a 60,000 pound per hour fired HRSG. At that point, there was no Davis and Jeffords, and they were connecting the 9 largest buildings. We've added obviously the 2. At that time, steam loads out of the cage were peaking in the 130,000 pounds per hour or higher. So what I want to hit you with here is that in 2012, based upon the information given by physical facilities staff, we've added 2 more buildings. The UVM Utilities Group has done a lot of energy efficiency and conservation, and this has actually lowered electrical and thermal loads, even though we've increased the number of buildings here. Thus, we've ended up with a 3.5 megawatt gas turbine and a smaller fired HRSG. Despite all that, time has marched on, and project costs have increased since that 2006 study. So the 2006 study was quite comprehensive, much more than we would do at this stage in the project. The base conditions have changed, and we're looking at a slightly smaller project. And we'll take, in the full report, we do a lot of simple first year annual savings, simple payback analysis, so we did that here. And there's a bit of a twist. We're not exactly sure what the electricity price is for the UVM campus. So we sort of hit numbers between 12.1 and 15 cents average, and we did that repeatedly through here. And meanwhile, gas price is a little bit uncertain because it's actually going to start decreasing shortly with the shale gas paradigm, and hopefully the gas suppliers will pass those savings on to you. So we looked anywhere from $5 per million BTUs up to $12.85 per million BTUs. And of course, what you are doing is, by using cogeneration, you're avoiding electricity. You have a cost to install it. You're saving so much per year. In the first year, say 6.3. Your total costs are the net. First year annual savings around 2.2. Simple payback 7 to 5. As costs increase, all the way up to 15, 8 years. And there's a lot more detail in the study, obviously. We also did a 20-year present worth break-even point analysis, because in that 2006 study, that was how they presented their information. So we try to duplicate that economic evaluation. And they showed break-even points like in the 10th, 13th year. And when gas was really expensive, they did not show any break-even point, and net present worth of virtually nothing or less, basically. So cogeneration for you can make sense under the right circumstances. We certainly think it warrants further examination at your facility, and that's a logical thing to do for your campus. Let me move on to University Heights, which is that core of 6 buildings. I'm not too sure where it is from here. Point that way, okay. And what we quickly discovered based upon the school due electrical data was that they have an absolutely steady load of about 250 kilowatts. That's obviously very modest compared to what I was just talking about. And they use a hot water heating system, which is fed by the cage steam distribution system, basically. So the steam comes here, it goes in heat exchangers, hot water heating. And so what are the candidate technologies? I don't really think that's a place where you want to build a steam plant. That just takes too much extra equipment. Let's do something that can make hot water. That's things like little micro turbines, fuel cells, gas-fired reciprocating engines. Some of these come with integral. Cogeneration systems come with an external system. You have to add it on yourself, basically, but they all can make hot water in varying degrees for you, basically. So we went through that, and it's detailed in the study, and what we found, basically, this technology is relatively expensive. It is expensive. And it was only when we were assuming cheap gas and high electricity prices to be avoided did we find that, say, capstone microturbines, you might have heard of capstone, might have a payback of 8 years. Their larger unit might have a payback of 8 years. A typical reciprocating engine, you might call them diesels, they're actually gas-fired reciprocating engines, 6-year payback. For reference, we showed the United Technologies fuel cell, which is a 400 kilowatt rated animal, but it's too big. That's 400 kilowatts, that's too big for University Heights, but in theory it has some form of payback. As we increased the gas price and made other assumptions on electricity, these technologies at that facility made less and less sense, basically. And one of the twists, of course, is that you can't really operate this unless there's a hot water heating load at University Heights at that point in time, basically. So you have to do, basically turn it off for a good deal of the year when hot water heating is not being needed. Okay. By the way, we invite questions.
I'm just going to say that from what I've understood, the gas prices in the Northeast and the electricity prices track together. More.
They
close.
should. They should, but they.
With the new gas
Paradigm.
Paradigm is kind of a frightening word in this case, but I guess so. Yeah. Anyway, just in the projections that I saw Burlington Electric making, and people are still talking about those natural gas prices being the sort of, what's going to drive electricity prices in the Northeast.
Yeah, hopefully, that's right.
So they're going to go together. It's not going to be one going up higher than the other. It leaves us even more in the middle and more, having the decision be even less
All
clear.
projections are, if you should know that about 5 years ago, gas was about $14 per million BTUs in many jurisdictions. That's the burner tip, that's the delivered price. In a lot of jurisdictions, it's already down to $5, and there's no intimation that it will increase much past that, especially if shale gas develops the way it is anticipated to do. I mean, it has obviously its own barriers, but there's been a total paradigm shift in natural gas prices, which affects everything, including electricity. So, thank you.
Any other questions? We'll field them at the end too, so hopefully I get to speak up now. The next technology we looked at was solar thermal, solar hot water. Basically what we looked at was solar and hot water applications for buildings. Now specifically, we started our report looking at the various technologies that are available, and the buildings that we identified were buildings that have consistent year-round hot water demand. Now, being a college where there's not as many people here in the summer, that poses some challenges. So we identified the following locations based on researching where the summer programs were, where the students were staying, what buildings were open all year, and what buildings used hot water. Obviously, dining halls, residence halls are the primary users. We also researched the incentives, and as you can see, they're pretty good. They pay for probably around 30% of a typical installation, and the details of which could be found in the site reports. The challenges that I mentioned under the central steam plant is that all the buildings we've identified get their hot water via a steam heat exchanger, and therefore get their hot water from the central steam plant. So implementing a solar thermal system on a building which gets their hot water from a central steam plant, evaluating the economics of that, the payback does not often exist, because if you take 1/10 of 1% of the steam load off of your central system, the money that you're saving there it's not really comparable to the capital cost of the solar thermal system. If you were to have buildings that had consistent hot water demand and were fed by, say, a natural gas hot water heater or an electric hot water heater, the paybacks of these systems would be much, much better. But like I said, in this case, the buildings we identified are fed via the central steam plant. So here's a typical installation site report for Harris Millis Commons. Working with an installer, we were able to identify the solar thermal offset, and this is for 40 collectors, 20 on either side of the building. And the number of arrays is 5. There's a maximum number of panels you're allowed to group together. We have your domestic hot water demand that's estimated. I'm not sure if it's actual or not. It's based on the estimated number of meals served. And the temperature setting, obviously, depending on if you're using it for, you know, residence hall or dining hall, the temperature requirement is different, and that would vary accordingly. And you can see the solar thermal offset by month, and again, that's estimated based on your domestic hot water demand.
So is that
Next technology.
a glycol system?
Yep. So I wish I had a picture here. This is actually Bates College. It's a picture we got from the manufacturer we work with. It's a closed loop glycol system, and what you'd have is you'd have a solar thermal storage tank, and you're going to heat that tank up to around probably 100 degrees in the winter and 130 degrees in the summer. And then you're going to pull hot water from there and heat it any additionally that you would need via either a natural gas hot water heater or, you know, your hot water heater with a steam heat exchanger. And it should be noted that to integrate this with a steam-fed hot water heater is just slightly more complicated and is expensive, as you might imagine.
Could you describe that technology a little bit? Could you use the flame or
Yeah, sure.
describe that?
When you want to interconnect it with one with the steam, so you have a closed loop of glycol that's going to travel through these solar thermal panels, get heated to, say, maybe 300, 400 degrees in the summer. That's going to go into a solar storage tank, which, let me see if I wrote that on the site report. They're normally around 600, 700,000 gallons for some of these systems. And you're going to heat that storage tank to around 100 degrees, 120 degrees, 130 degrees. And so therefore, when you're pulling your water to heat via your steam heat exchanger, instead of heating it from, say, 50 degrees in the ground, you're heating it from 100 degrees. So the energy required there is much, much less, and that's how you achieve your cost savings.
So you're adding an extra
Yep.
heat exchanger.
You would add another storage tank right next to your existing storage tank, or you could replace your existing with one that can do all three.
It might be good at the end of your presentation to maybe come back to this.
Okay,
So I have a couple of questions.
sure.
Or we want some kind of large or relatively large and consistent load in a building or a small nest of buildings, and we want a heat load for the UTC model. All right, so fuel cells are characterized, quite frankly, with very high installed costs. The paybacks seem good, and sometimes when you read it in the newspapers or talk to the manufacturers, one can never forget that the fuel cells degrade in power output over time. They're losing about 1 or 2% per annum per year sort of thing. And as far as we can figure, a stack replacement is needed at about year 10, basically, and that's almost the cost of the fuel cell, basically, and it would be at the 10th year, it would cost the same. So they have tremendous challenges compared to other technologies, basically. They are potentially economically viable, again, if we're looking at low gas prices coming to them, and high electricity prices to avoid. Again, the easiest one, when we went to the $5 gas and the 15-cent kilowatt hour electricity scenario, we're seeing that the Bloom, which had no cogeneration in it basically, is a payback in around the 13-year basis. The larger module about in the 9-year basis, and the UTC 400 kilowatt module in the 6-year payback basis. And this was out without considering any specific locations on the campus. This is just generically what that can do in the right nest. We did try to apply that to University Heights and just didn't see a great result. I would say, quite frankly, folks, that, you know, when you're looking at numbers like this, $76,000, $10,000 difference for any number of reasons, like I need to buy flanges and bolts and put them on, and that changes the payback just like that in 2 or 3 years, basically. Small technology, very sensitive to costs, both operating and maintenance and such. So there are still challenges with fuel cells. Yes, we do see in the literature and in the internet, some people are saying, oh, I'm saving $300,000 a year. There's other people with the same modules on the same internet saving $30,000 a year. We can't make any sense of it other than There are dramatic incentives in some jurisdictions for these products, and it appears that the vendors play a large play in basically subsidizing the fuel cell installations. We quite frankly say to you in the report, if you want to talk to United Technologies and become some kind of pioneering site, go for it. Talk to them. You know, do you want to test something out here on campus and see what kind of deal you can swing? It's entirely possible. And that's, biomass now. We had to cover biomass. Typically wood chips, bark, sawdust, wood process residues, wood pellets, all ground can be agricultural waste, can be yard clippings, and even in the municipal solid wastes. The normal products are either thermal energy, meaning steam or hot water or something like that. We can make both electricity and thermal energy, or we can make a renewable biogas or a syngas, which then can be used in some form of conventional combustion technology, either in an engine or in a boiler itself. So in our study, we looked at three things basically. In 2011, the interns, some interns did a Trinity biomass study. Basically, they examined two things: a biomass boiler, which would make hot water directly and sort of displace the existing gas-fired boilers up at Trinity. They also looked at an alternative where they made gas from the biomass. It's called a gasifier, and then they operated the existing gas boilers with that gas, basically. The basic economic and other considerations that arise out of biomass: very high capital cost for either that boiler or gasifier technology. Biomass price is an uncertainty. The interns certainly identified that. There's no reason to believe it's not uncertain, basically. And we actually looked at cases which had the interns price and double that price, basically. There are tremendous externalities with biomass. You are hauling a lot of material right through these city streets, basically. There's physical space required to store biomass. It piles of wood, literally, folks. It's a dirty process. It's very visceral. You're looking at shovels and buckets, work kind of stuff. And because of that, you're going to need additional operators and operation and maintenance costs for any biomass facility. What we identified at current gas prices, we're looking at about 10 to 14 years payback, but this will be uncompetitive if gas prices drop, basically. And it certainly may be uncompetitive versus an extension of the UVM steam distribution system to Trinity campus, which we understand is possibly under consideration. And, you know, Jack will talk about that. Maybe geothermal could play a part at Trinity campus itself. So that was basically a revisit of the intern study, where they just looked at heating. We also took a look at cogeneration up at Trinity campus, where we did not only some heating, but also the creation of electricity. And we understand that there's a, you know, UVM is considering a district heating system up at Trinity campus. You will need a new large buried piping system there, and you will need to convert your existing electrically heated buildings and rooms to hot water coils to do that. So we just said, well, that's a price that sits out there. We're not going to include it in the biomass price, whether you do it as gas-fired district heating or otherwise. That just sits out there. So we just took a look at a small, modest cogeneration system that would produce hot water and about 100 kilowatts of electricity output, 1.2 million BTUs per hour of thermal output. But both of those really only in the heating system, basically. That system, AG125 by AgriPower, basically, that's one of several proprietary biomass cogeneration systems, would cost you in the order of $3 and $3.5 million, not including those buried services and all those conversions that would be needed for either system, basically. Simple payback in the order of 20 to 70 years, so it's a bit of a struggle. One can fuss with the numbers a little bit, but that's the order of magnitude. And that biomass standard offer program price of 12.5 cents really doesn't improve that economics at all, basically.
Jim, your
Yes.
simple payback is based on an uncertain biomass price currently, though.
That's right. I looked at the interns' price that they carried in 2011 because they did a lot of research. I'm not going to duplicate that, and then I doubled it basically. And they could easily double because those were relatively modest prices that the interns used. my gut feel was it might have been a little bit low to start with, you know. But I'm not an expert in the fuel supply here in Vermont. Basically, I know there's this active forest management, so it's very good, but it's a market that competes, right? Everybody wants biomass. As soon as everybody wants it, the price is going to go up, basically. So.
Well, Colby College just did a biomass plant, and it made sense to them because they have no natural gas to their campus.
Okay.
And they have sustainable lumbering going on within 50 miles. It's
Excellent.
very rural. So it made a lot of sense for them. Their
Right.
payback was really good. But they made it very clear that if they had natural gas to their campus, they probably wouldn't have done it.
Great. I think that's a relatively fair capture. Is that the externalities of systems will usually overrule, basically, right?
And
You
it's
know.
easy to get the trucks in and out of there
Yeah.
from the rural
And
where
whereas,
they
I'm
are.
sorry, where's Trinity? I think it's
Where
right
they are,
over there. Yeah, as I understand it, there's always, you know, the intern certainly expressed the public reaction to that truck traffic was rather negative, to say the least. Not everybody knows why. And quite frankly, piles of biomass, unless you put them in a building, which cost more, you know, they blow around.
Right.
They get rained on, you know, it's a very visceral process. It's not the same as a gas kit for ferments,
They
great.
stink.
And I think they added at least one position, if not more, because it's a lot of maintenance. The augers get plugged up and it's,
You know,
it's pretty
typically up
intense.
in Canada, we use $100,000 for every person. Down here, for some reason, we use $70,000, but that could destroy these annual savings, basically,
Right.
because we did not include additional staffing in here.
Yeah,
But that can destroy, that can change your simple payback from 8 to 0
yeah.
with one person. Yes, sir, Matt?
Did none of the other cogeneration systems make sense at Trinity besides, I mean, the biomass doesn't seem to. I mean, did you look at other systems?
The fuel cell sort of technology.
Fuel cell?
It's such a small island of electricity. Like when you're looking at small kilowatts like this, the economy scale really starts killing you. Cogeneration makes sense when you're starting to talk, like even the 3.5 megawatt at Cage is relatively small. As you know, Cornell has a 30 megawatt cogen, things like that, right? So,
You don't have the thermal load year round, and you also don't have an electric load in the nighttime, so ideal place is when you have a constant thermal load or a constant electric load, so you just let that unit hum away.
yes,
It's
exactly. Turn it on, run it to 100% and leave it there. Even the Cage struggles with that. I could draw a little thing here, but the problem with our 11 buildings that we're connected to on the Cage one, basically, is that a gas turbine makes great power in the winter and less in the summer, and unfortunately, the 11 buildings go the other way, basically. You know, January to December, basically. So there's compromises, right, on the cogen side. I mean, it still warrants further examination. There's tremendous savings in, I'll just say, cost and certainly efficiency and carbon credits associated with cogen, but our initial evaluation says it ain't over. We should all take another look at it, basically. Can I move on? Yes, and so Matt, to sort of answer your question, we took that same AG125 system that we were talking about with Trinity, and we took it to the Cage complex, basically. And instead of trying to make steam with it, we basically preheated the condensate, which was coming back from all the various condensate lines, and that decreases the deaerator or the auxiliary steam consumption within the Cage plant itself. Not a lot, it's modest, but it isn't a gain, basically. And we did the same analysis. It's still basically still in the $3 to $3.5 million. We have the same externalities, other than the trucks are now driving into the middle of the campus, and there's piles of wood near campus buildings. Simple payback, 20 to 90 years in this case. And again, the speed biomass standard offer price does not really improve those economics. Thank you.
Any questions for you?
I'm here all year.
The next technology we looked at was anaerobic digestion. It was not originally asked for in the RFP, but we did a project for another client, and when I heard you guys had an existing composting program, I thought it would be a good thing to look into. And I am admittedly not an expert on anaerobic digestion, but I'll try to get through this the best I can. You currently have organic waste collection from dining halls, private residences, your compost program. and the 30 to 40 cows you have at the farm. So all that adds up to about 1,000 tons a year. And reading and analyzing your existing study done in 2009, we determined that creating renewable gas and generating electricity was non-viable. So what we decided to look at was taking renewable gas and using it to power natural gas vehicles. So that would obviously involve building an anaerobic digester, a fueling station, some storage area, and then converting your fleet vehicles to natural gas. Slowly over time, maybe start with 1 or 2 trucks and go from there. So we did an economic analysis of the project. There's a large capital investment to the tune of almost $2 million. And the operations costs to run this type of setup basically equal your fuel savings. So therefore, strictly speaking, there is no payback for this type of system. But if you can take into consideration all of the negative aspects that come with gasoline fleet vehicles, diesel fleet vehicles, and sort of the non-economic aspects, the externalities, then a system like this might make sense because it has environmental advantages, and in my opinion, it's a quote-unquote cool factor. But ultimately, we did conclude that the payback was non-existent because the operations costs equal the fuel savings roughly. And I'll pass it on to Joe. He's going to do a report on wind.
So wind energy. For the campus here, we looked at really two types of turbines anyway, the small and then the micro. Really, with the space limitations, that are present here, there's really there's no possibility of doing anything bigger than a small. Even the small, as we'll see, is kind of restricted to only a few areas. The micro wind turbines, they are interesting because you use a lot smaller of a footprint as far as where they can be installed. They're, as the quiet revolution 6.5 kW is named, they're a bit quieter. They're a little less, of a distraction, I would say. They're a little less of an eyesore. However, they are there's some difficulties that come with them. I mean, aside from the fact that they don't have a great energy output, they're 6.5 kilowatts, not very much. You have to factor in, you still have to factor in some space. And if you're going to put it on a building, a lot of things do come into play there as far as the structural integrity of the building and all that stuff. So even, we looked at the installation cost of the micro wind turbines and then the projected energy output with the winds that we see here at UVM, which, as you see, they're actually below the class 1, the average. I think the highest wind speed we found at any of the sites surveyed was, I think, 10.9 miles per hour. So even with higher wind speeds than that, the payback is still over 20, maybe 30 years for the micro wind turbines. So we really kind of ruled those out and focused on the small wind turbines. So with those, you still need to factor in space. They're 130 feet tall to the hub, and then they're 75-foot rotor. With that in mind, you have to take into account if they were to fall, what's in the way. So you can't put one right here on Main Street anywhere. Obviously, you got to kind of look for a more open space. There are incentives that do apply, as Jack kind of went over earlier, so I won't spend much time on that. But using some of that, I think you get $1.20 per kilowatt hour, if I remember correctly, as far as payback on those. But the other nice thing about the small wind turbines is there's the Northern Power Systems right here in Vermont. They make it's called the Northwind 100, which is a 100 kilowatt turbine. And looking at that and looking at the sites on campus, the places we looked really were around the Miller Farm, the Bio Research Complexes, the area west of the Living and Learning, and west of Bailey Howe and Centennial Woods nature area. With those sites, we found that of all those, the highest wind speeds were Miller Farm at 10.9 miles per hour, and to me, it's kind of, I don't know, and I talked about this with Jack before. It seems like, especially a day like yesterday and night like last night, or I don't know if anyone else was woken up by the wind. It just seems like there are higher wind speeds here than are actually found. But just you have those days where there's really high winds, and then then you have more of these though, where there's really nothing to speak of. So it brings the average wind speed down. And I mean, a night like last night, for a lot of times if it's too gusty, you can't even run the turbines. So those days are kind of useless as far as it's concerned. So the average wind speed of 11.6 miles per hour. That's right. That's category 1. It's 10.9 miles per hour for the Miller Farm area. We looked at putting in one of the Northwind 100 turbines there, and there's a picture of one at Bolton Valley, which actually I saw I picked up there a couple weekends ago. That's not my picture though. That was
It's actually one of the interns pictures.
yeah, exactly. So looking at that, install cost of $640,000. With that, and taking into account the incentives that we mentioned earlier, and then there's the location right there, and the site wind speed at 10.9 miles per hour. With all that considered, the payback term for that would be roughly 18 years. And if it were net metered there, you would be offsetting about 25 to 35% of the electricity usage for the complex there. I believe that's it for wind energy. Is there any questions before I pass on geothermal section?
I think in your report, Jack, didn't you include some information about a brief description of building mounted turbines as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We reviewed about, I think it was like 12 or 15 different types of building mounted turbines. Identified their pros and cons, their estimated installed costs, and almost all of them have fatal flaws. Either it being that they cost $50,000 and only make $1,000 worth of power a year, making the payback absurd, or they have to be pole mounted on top of a building, which, as you may be aware, poses some structural problems, and to get those kind of approvals and permits, that drives the cost up, the engineering costs. So I feel like in general, these micro turbines, if you were a private citizen and you can take advantage of some of the tax credits, and you could afford to not do all the detailed engineering that might be required for a college or university, the paybacks could be in the reasonable term. Also, the estimated power outputs for these and the realistic power outputs don't always match. I went to Union College in New York. They have 3 vertical axis wind turbines, and they were touted to save X amount of dollars a year, and at year 1 they were producing about 50% what they were supposed to. And that's because the company that they hired, they put 3 in a row, and the 2 turbines on the end blocked the one in the middle. So obviously there's siting conditions, there's site concerns, and there's only so much you can predict about the wind when you're installing these, so they often don't add up. But I feel like the quote-unquote small wind turbines, like the Northern Power Systems, which is actually quite tall, could be a viable possibility on campus.
What's the visibility of having a 75-foot tower at the Miller Farm? I mean, what does that affect?
Victoria, how tall is the one that's on Main Street? Isn't that at the bottom?
The one on Main Street probably is on an 80-foot tower, I guess.
What's-
These are 130-foot tower plus 75-foot of blade. So they are pretty tall.
205 feet to the...
I actually, I must have the wrong numbers, 'cause I know they're under 200 feet, otherwise you'd have to get FAA approval. But,
I'm not sure the blades are quite that big.
yeah. The blades are, they have 20 meter and 24 meter option. So it would be more like a 65-foot blade, give or take.
Is that what you were asking?
Well, I mean, that's, I think, would be any problem with wind is who's going to have to see it. So.
Well, everyone who drove on the highway would see it. Which could be a good thing or a bad thing. In the state of Vermont, it can go both ways. I know the state is divided.
It's more about people who have a house looking at Mansfield.
I don't think it's the driver as much as it is the
Yeah. But that area is relatively free. I mean, you have the Miller Farm and you have farmland south of that and the highway. So, I'll take more questions at the end if you'd like. On to geothermal. The geothermal systems we looked at were ground source heat pumps, which basically take thermal energy from the ground, bring it up to your building via heat exchanger. You could have closed loop, open loop, there's a number of different types, but they all basically do the same thing. They take heat from the ground, bring it to your building, or vice versa, take heat from your building, put it into the ground, therefore cool it. The site selection, we surveyed campus knowing that we needed to be off of the central heat plant and we needed available space. And we also needed to have a heating and cooling load to make the project economics work, because geothermal can heat and cool, so if you only have one of the two, the economics doesn't work out quite as well. So the sites we identified were the back 5, Mercy McCauley, Blundell House, Manhall, the UVM Rescue Police Services PVD building, and water. The back 5 and Mercy McCauley we identified to be the best of those sites because you were already interested in replacing the electric heat on the back 5.
What is the back 5?
The back 5 is the 5 buildings on Trinity campus, the 5 identical ones.
It turns out that's the one I was talking about too, so in the biomass one, so
And they all have electric heat.
very expensive.
It's the ones we should tear down and build in the dorm.
No, that's a
That-
major solution.
That project would probably be better. And then Mercy and McCauley, where I've heard that you're already interested in replacing those boilers. So replacing them with a hydronic natural gas boiler augmented with geothermal would possibly make sense in that case too. And on the back 5, what you would be doing is replacing all of the building's heating infrastructure. You would add a natural gas boiler augmented with geothermal. And typically we see up to 30% savings versus traditional heat. But we were not able to do a full economic analysis for geothermal at this time, because the costs largely depend on how much piping and what we're required to replace, and we need more information. But I think that considering the back 5 and Mercy McCauley, comparing natural gas heating, cooling augmented with geothermal would be competitive with an extension of the steam system, and certainly competitive with the biomass options we identified before. Yes?
Are there options to combine geothermal and solar PV?
Certainly, yeah. That's an excellent option. The buildings on the back 5 and Mercy McCauley had some PV options. I think we're looking at, they were all under 20 kW, I believe. So when you compare that to the overall building usage, you're talking about 5% to 10% maybe. So I think there are better buildings for solar PV. Solar PV has good economies of scale. So when you're talking about a project on, say, the library versus the back 5, the library we estimated to be 250 kW. The unit cost for that goes down a lot when you get up in size. So comparing the two projects, you'd see that there are better buildings available. You could combine solar thermal with geothermal, but again, the paybacks are largely dependent on what you're saving, what you're offsetting. So if you were to install natural gas at the back 5, a geothermal solar thermal combo would be appealing. If you were to extend the steam system, then comparing that would make sense. Now, if we could review some of the next steps we've identified for your sustainability push, is to continue to investigate these options, do more detailed studies, continue to talk about your buildings and systems efficiency, to find negawatts, places you can save electricity, continue to improve your steam and your condensate distribution system, to look at smart metering, which I'm glad to hear you've already been doing, and to examine your electrical loads and invoice aggregation. I mean, you receive 130 electric bills every month. I mean, I think that there could be something done there with BED to make that process a little bit easier for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, the last bullet is not about energy efficiency, it's about cost price, basically. There's a lot that can be done here. I think everybody knows it. It's just the will to do something appropriate. I know it requires negotiation with parties who probably don't want to negotiate, but
BED has basically said we will always pay the same for electricity whether we save or not. Okay, we are their big client, and
Yeah.
they are never going to reduce our bill,
Yeah.
basically.
Because
So
then
we
they-
have to do this because of the carbon footprint, because we want to
Yeah.
reduce it. And they made that very clear just a few months ago, and
that's unfortunate then.
Well,
they're not going to increase their residential costs because we're saving energy. That's their view, because they're a city municipality. Owned.
Yet the search for megawatts is very important. I mean, I walk in the men's washroom in this building and the lights turned off. I think that's a great thing. That should be, continue to find that sort of stuff. There's a lot to be gained with that. The major energy utilizer in your system, in your campus, is the steam distribution system. And, it takes a lot of energy to make that. And if you lose energy in the pipes in the ground to the ground, it's energy lost. Since 2006, it's obvious that the utilities group has done a lot to improve that, but they just need to do it one piece at a time. It's a tremendous benefit, quite frankly, and it's not generating anything, it's saving, obviously, efficiency. So you need to continue in that area. To jump up to the top one here, though, it's interesting in that we've talked about a series of technologies, and curiously enough, they sort of compete against each other. If you put solar on the 11 buildings that I talked about as CHP, well, the load for CHP went down, you're building a smaller cogen plant, etc. So they're competing. So you need to sort of prioritize what's most important, that sort of thing. That's certainly what you need to go through at this point. Okay.
and with that, we'll take questions. I'm sure you've got some holdover from other sites.